Hey, Chris Weckelo here, coming to you once again from the lovely Montbury Park in Lake Forest, California, at night, in the evening, because once again, it's just a more convenient time of day, of course, and just less people, less distractions, much better environment to deliver a presentation like this. And A friend had recently suggested that I begin calling these the Montbury Chronicles, which I believe I'm going to do, but the full title I've arrived at is Jude's Montbury Chronicles of Franco America, given the one of the topics I'll be returning to from time to time, but not in every video, but aspects of American history and even world history, global history relating to the French, France, and French Canadians and so forth, because of the amount of information, the amount of interesting stories that I've come across in delving into my own, a portion of my own family background, family lineage. And so without further ado, I will proceed right into it. That, of course, in American history, and to a larger degree too, or to a certain degree, in world history as well, popular images of the French are not always very flattering, not the most flattering, that they had surrendered, of course, during World War II, that kind of Napoleon's empire building, even though ethnically he wasn't actually French, he was Corsican, and before his ancestors had lived in Corsica, they had been Tuscan Italian and so forth. But and then in the United States, the image of or the story and the history of the French and Indian War, which is the 7 Years' War, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, and King George's War, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and these colonial conflicts between the upper northernly-most of the 13 colonies, such as New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, etc., and the French in Canada, and of course certain celebrities that are maybe of a French Canadian background, like Jim Carrey, etc., and then and the history of New England, where I'm from, is certainly not looked at as one that has deep French connections, if you will, and when thinking of such things, it's usually maybe certain people like the author, like Jack Kerouac, whose parents were from Quebec and had settled in Massachusetts in the early 20th century. But there is a interesting, more complicated history in that region, as in other parts of the United States, that deserves looking into, and for me has revealed some very interesting stories, and that it's not all cut and dry, one or the other, black or white. There's a lot of gray in American history, in early American history, which I've certainly learned, just in having a degree in history from the University of New Hampshire, having an interest in history as kind of an armchair historian, being a living historian, reenactor. Delving into my genealogy for years now, which most of my friends in Facebook have seen, have withstood my not constant, but somewhat frequent posting about my genealogy, but which certainly hasn't been at all to boast, but just because it's in this age of finding your roots, and that show on PBS and other things of that nature, and Ancestry.com, and genetic testing and so forth, and all these various companies, that it's just has seemed like the appropriate time and the right time to share such things, and appropriate time. So once again, without further ado, I'll come right to the point that going back quite early, actually, in New England, even though we have the image of the Pilgrims, the Puritans, the Mayflower, etc., Salem, Massachusetts, Salem witch trials, etc., there was an earlier, as I've mentioned in some of my earlier videos as well, there was an earlier, you could say, Franco-American history to the area, where there is a National Park Service site actually dedicated to one of these stories in the state of Maine called the St. Croix International Historical Site, and I believe in the French language it would be Croix, Saint Croix maybe. I'm not, I'm not a French language expert or scholar, and I'm not fluent in French, but and it commemorates actually what was a failed settlement, but was also though the first European settlement in what would later be known as and named New England by the Sieur de Mon, a French nobleman and explorer, and Samuel de Champlain in Maine. And from that site in northeastern Maine, Samuel de Champlain proceeded along down east down the coast of Maine and along the coast of what is today New Hampshire to Massachusetts, and became the earliest European, and of course I did bring this up in some previous videos, but to have entered what is today Gloucester Harbor. He traded with he and his men and his sailors of his crew. Excuse me here for annoyingly shifting hands, but he and his crew did trade with, and he's wrote about it in his journals, trade with the Native Americans in those areas. Of course, they rowed to shore. Some men died either from attacks or disease, I can't recall. And there was an instance where some of these men were buried on shore in what would be today, I believe, in Gloucester or somewhere there in Cape Ann, Massachusetts. And from the ship, after Champlain and the remaining sailors and crew had gone back to the ship, they noticed the Native Americans dug up the bodies of these French sailors and kind of mockingly were taking the shirts and clothing off of them and putting them on and so forth and other things of that nature, without providing too much more information about that, so that there are markers in Gloucester, Massachusetts. They're not in a very good state of repair that describe some of this story, and the Native Americans in that area of Cape Ann, what is today Cape Ann, Massachusetts, they provided kind of they had drawn kind of an outline, a map, like an outline, so to speak, of the coastline of Massachusetts further south, which aided Champlain in proceeding on in his travels, his voyage along the seaboard there, the seacoast of Massachusetts. And he did become the first European to enter what is today Boston Harbor and the Boston Harbor Islands, and explored that area. And just as he did in Gloucester, he drew maps of this. He drew he created illustrations. He wrote about it. Which is kind of interesting and relates to interweave this and connect it to my own personal family's genealogy and my personal background. I later found through the French-Canadian part of my family tree that I'm descended from some of the later Puritans who founded Boston and who, of course, landed there at what was the Shawmut Peninsula, which became Boston. And then I've also got family connections to Champlain. In one of his explorations in the year 1613, there's a man named Nicholas Marcellet, who's my direct ancestor, who was along with him, who took part in that that bit of exploring that particular venture in 1613. And I also am descended from a woman who was the first French child to be born in New France in Canada, and she was, believe she was included in Samuel de Champlain's will. So I actually kind of have an interesting connection to, and I'm, to both aspects of that history of Boston Harbor and Boston, from the Puritans that I descend from, and also from the French, from Champlain, which is once again not shared to be boastful at all, but that was really news to me. I had no knowledge of this at all growing up. So it was and still is quite fascinating, and also somewhat difficult for me to wrap my mind around. It's just was so far outside of what I would have ever expected. So, and then of course, but to continue on, Champlain did proceed to Cape Cod, and he named it Cap Blanc. And he also named, which means the White Cape in French, and he also named a particular area of shoals, I think, along Cape Cod, Malbar, like the bad sandbar, like translated into the English language. And the maps that he created and the illustrations he created were known to the Pilgrims, 15 years later. And of course, this is all, once again, as I just said, 15 years or thereabouts before the landing of the Mayflower. So it's pretty amazing. And there's a book by the author, Brandeis University history professor David Hackett Fisher, named Champlain's Dream, which discusses all this. And he delves into it quite deeply. And there's a lot of, what's the term I'm looking for? A lot of, footnotes and so forth, and a lot of other information in the appendix of the book. It's a voluminous, thick book, and it talks all about that, all about Champlain and the French, who, as I said, have not had such a great reputation in American history, or in the the history of in the English-speaking world at large. But that was certainly something to remember, and I believe there are markers too on Cape Cod for Champlain's voyage and what had taken place within those 15 years or so before, between Champlain's explorations and the Mayflower, were a decimation of the Native American population, sadly enough, along the coast of Massachusetts, which might have been somewhat caused by the French sailors themselves, and also other English traders, fishermen plying the coast of Massachusetts before the Mayflower, between Champlain's voyage and the Mayflower's landing. And so that by the time that the Mayflower landed, of course, as many history buffs out there will know, the site of what would later be named Plymouth, which the Native Americans had named Patuxet. The Mayflower Pilgrims found the skeletal remains of Native Americans there in that village of Patuxet, which had been the famous Native American Squanto's home, and that's because of what had taken place between Champlain's voyage and the landing of the Mayflower. And to go on from there, and I'm going to need to pick up the pace a little bit, and of course, TikTok's probably going to cut the length of this video is going to be too long, and a lot of it's going to be cut out, probably by TikTok anyway, so it's probably somewhat pointless to be even delving into any of this, but I will regardless. So other very fascinating stories, and it's not related to Samuel de Champlain, who was a French Catholic, but a story related to French Huguenots, who were nevertheless French, who were involved in the early history of Massachusetts, and to kind of list them and begin sharing these stories. The first one of which is that I believe his name was Peter Faneuil, the namesake of Faneuil, the famous Faneuil Hall in Boston, who, what was a noted slave trader, I suppose, or slave dealer, or had owned slaves and was involved in the slave trade, I should say, which is disgraceful and horrible and disgusting. But he was, I believe, maybe not him himself, but I think his father or his grandfather was a French Huguenot, and they had come from the area of La Rochelle, France, where I have many connections to in the 17th century in my own family tree, including the Charbonneau family line that I descend from, that's connected to Toussaint Charbonneau. The Lewis and Clark expedition were from there in La Rochelle, and the Faneuil family of Faneuil Hall fame there in Boston were from La Rochelle too. And then to speed things up a little bit, Bowdoin College, the famous Bowdoin College in Maine, was named for a colonial governor of Massachusetts whose surname was Bowdoin, but whose surname had his family surname had originally been Baudouin. I believe is how it's pronounced in the French language. Possibly, I'm probably not correct, but it could be. And that what's interesting too, connects to my own family tree, is that that same exact spelling, and I believe it was Baudouin, the original spelling before Bowdoin, I think of as like the name of Bowdoin College. That name Baudouin, which it originally was, is in my family tree, and at the same time as when the Baudouins, who later became Bowdoins, came to Boston in the 1680s, as when the Faneuil family did as well. And I believe, based on research I've done also in the past couple of months, I believe I'm actually connected as a third cousin a few times removed. It seemed very likely to the Bowdoin governor of Massachusetts that Bowdoin College is named for. So that was pretty amazing. Quite an honor to find that out too. And then moving right along, a famous alumni and later president of Bowdoin College, Joshua Chamberlain of Gettysburg and the Battle of Little Round Top fame, his great-great-grandfather, was also a French Huguenot whose surname was Dupuis, and that was spelled D-U-P-U-I-S, who had come in the 1680s as a Huguenot to Boston, just as the Bowdoin family, or Bowdoin, and Faneuil family, his great-great-grandfather through his mother's family lines, whose surname was Dupuis, came in the 1680s as a Huguenot. And I actually once again have a connection. At that same time in the 1680s, I have a Moise Dupuis in my family tree, who was from New France, from Quebec and Montreal, who had come into the New York colony, into New York, and married a Dutch woman in the 1680s or 90s. And that's the same time as Joshua Chamberlain's great-great-grandfather, who's also Dupuis, surname Dupuis, came into Boston. So it's pretty mind-blowing to find some of this, to once again to have unearthed and uncovered all this stuff, all this information. Has been, as I've said before, and as as corny as it might sound, endlessly fascinating. And so moving along from there, there were early French Huguenots also in Pennsylvania, and I'm descended from one of them once again, there was a man named Peter Bezelon, as he was known in the anglicized form of his name, who came in the late 1680s to Pennsylvania, just a few short years after 1682, of course, when William Penn founded Philadelphia, and he became a pretty highly regarded, but not highly trusted by the English Quaker establishment, William Penn's Quaker establishment, because he was French, but he did retire a wealthy man, and he had been a trader, an interpreter, trapper, etc. in colonial Pennsylvania, and there are markers for him. They're in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where the Amish, which is heavily populated, of course, by the Amish, and where the movie Witness had been filmed, in that general area with the Harrison Ford film. And Pierre Bisson, or Peter Bezelon, as I had said, he was also involved in the founding of the Arkansas Post, the earliest European settlement in the lower Mississippi River Valley, and he's my 8 times great-granduncle, if I didn't mention that already. Going on from there, pretty fascinating to note that President George Washington's great-great-great-grandfather, and that's 3 times great-grandfather, was a man named Nicholas Marcio, or Marcier, or something to that effect, and I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly. And he was George Washington's earliest ancestor to have emigrated to the New World, to the colony of Jamestown in Virginia, and he helped to construct defenses for the colony because of the ongoing tensions between the English colonists in Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy of Native Americans there in Virginia. And there is a statue of this ancestor of Washington's in the part of France where he came from, which is once again very interesting personal connection for me. They were from very close to the area of La Rochelle, where parts of my own family tree originated in France, and there's a statue of George Washington there in that particular community, which is an island off of La Rochelle, France, that I've never visited, but I've read about. And there's a statue of George Washington there, and then on the base of the statue is affixed kind of a bronze, from what I've seen and read and was looking at the photos, like a bronze plaque to his ancestor Nicholas. Once again, I don't know if it was Marcier or something like that, but I had no knowledge of this whatsoever. But I watched a documentary by a young man from Scotland who, I think his channel is titled or called Celtic History Decoded, I think it is, and he mentioned in a video about some of the earlier ancestors of some of the founding fathers, I think it was, of the United States, and they mentioned this French ancestor of George Washington's, who, as it once again had come to Jamestown, Virginia in 1620 and was Washington's earliest ancestor in the New World. That was just pretty, once again, just mind-blowing, fascinating stuff. Going on from there, and I'll be trying to reach my conclusion pretty soon here, there was a rich, well-known, respected Huguenot French family in Charleston, South Carolina, who they were slave owners, which once again is shameful and is, disgusting and horrible. I completely, fully admit that. But they and they were also from the area, had been from the area of La Rochelle, France, where I've got ancestors. And their surname was Monigo, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And they were apparently, from what I read, were the richest family in the 13 colonies for a while, for a period there in the decades before the American before the American Revolution, excuse me. And then also, I believe to conclude, there might be some things I've forgotten, but I think I'll wrap up with this, is that people know that Jacques Cartier in the 1530s, I believe, had explored the St. Lawrence River Valley, river area in Canada, long before Samuel, several decades before Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, or before he explored, before Samuel de Champlain explored Massachusetts as well. But a few decades after that, in 1564, and some of you might know this story though, there was a group of French Huguenots led by a man named Jean Ribault, who had attempted to found a French settlement near what is today Jacksonville, Florida, in the northeastern portion of the present-day state of Florida. And he and the French Huguenots explored all the way up into South Carolina, along the coast of Georgia, and they were going to attempt to establish settlements in what would later become the southeastern United States. But they were wiped out by Pedro Menendez de Aviles, who would later go on, and his men, of course, that he led, who were Spanish conquistadors, because that the French, under Ribault, had been involved in some privateering and had been harassing the Spanish trade shipping lines, or trade network, not trade network, but excuse me, but their ships that were sailing back to the New World, laden with precious metals, I believe, and so forth. And so in essence, and I would say that, and I would agree with historians who would say that the French Huguenots unfortunately brought that on themselves by preying upon the Spanish shipping. But they were wiped out, executed, and there's an area near Jacksonville, I believe it's called Matanzas Inlet, which translated from Spanish into the English language would be like the inlet of the slaughter, where there were over 300 French Huguenots whose throats were slit by the conquistadors of Menendez. And I believe recently, I had learned over the past couple of years that some of Jean Ribault's ships and these little particular type of columns or pillars that were inscribed with the French fleur-de-lis and the other insignia of the French king at the time were going to be installed from what is today Jacksonville, Florida, up into South Carolina. That the French, the area that they were going to settle in what is today the southeastern United States, one of those ships has been found, and one of those columns has been found off of the coast of Jacksonville or St. Augustine, somewhere there. So which was very, very exciting to hear. They're very, very, quite interesting to learn about that. And I believe it's considered, or has been considered, the property of France, though, considering that those were French vessels, and there was a court battle between the United States and France and the state of Florida, I believe, in the country of France, and the French government, and the rights to those archaeological remains were awarded to France, which I think that deservedly so. And so in essence, because of that, because of the French being slaughtered there near Jacksonville in 1564, that's what then led to the French then focusing on settling in Canada and exploring New England, settling in Canada, creating Quebec and New France and Montreal, later Montreal and rather than the southeastern United States, because of that slaughter that had taken, that massacre that had taken place. And one last interesting thing, somewhat along these lines to think about, is that actually even Samuel de Champlain, in his voyages and his explorations and his, and so forth, before creating Quebec, before founding Quebec, he had actually visited Mexico in the 1590s, I believe, and had observed and taken notes on and studied the, took notes on the Spanish settlements there in Mexico in the late 1500s, which of course had been begun by Hernan, the Conquistador Hernan Cortez in 1519. And so, interesting to note that the founder of Quebec, and a man who, once again, he and his crew had been the first ones to explore Boston Harbor, Gloucester Harbor, and Cape Cod in Massachusetts, that he had been in Mexico before he did that. So, something interesting to consider during these unpleasant times when Mexico is being maligned by certain people in power. But I'm not going to go into that. And so that about wraps it up. That about concludes it for now. And so I will get back to you folks in the future. Have a good evening.